They told her to leave the range. They screamed at her, a civilian anomaly in their world of steel and cordite. Then the man who screamed the loudest saw the badge on her worn fatigues, a subtle etching of a cracked geode on a field of obsidian, a ghost from a forgotten directorate. By the time he and his captain understood what she was, she had already saved them. She had done it by listening to the one thing they had all ignored, the mountain itself. And when the silence fell, they understood that the mountain had a voice, and she was its interpreter. The silence in the Argus Mountain Range was a physical presence. It was not an absence of sound, but a pressure on the eardrums, a thick, viscous medium that seemed to clog the lungs. Forward operating base. Erebos was a wound carved into the flank of one of these granite titans, a collection of prefabricated habdomes and sandbagged emplacements that looked fragile, temporary, like a child's toys scattered at the foot of an indifferent god. The air was thin and sharp, tasting of ozone and cold stone, and every breath was a conscious effort. The sun, when it appeared from behind the jagged peaks that tore at the sky like black knives, was a merciless white disk that bleached all color from the landscape, leaving only shades of gray, brown, and the blinding glare of high-altitude snowfields. The wind was a constant, keening thing, a razor that stripped away warmth and sanity in equal measure. It was a place that did not want them there, and it made its displeasure known in every gust of wind, every tremor of the rock beneath their boots. Dr. Eris Thorne felt the mountain's displeasure not as a threat, but as a conversation. To her, the base was not just a military outpost. It was an acoustic anomaly, a discordant note in a symphony of geologic time. She spent her days walking the perimeter, not with a rifle, but with a suite of sensors that measured things the soldiers couldn't see and didn't care about. She noted the subtle shifts in lithospheric stress, the propagation of micro-tremors through the gneiss and schist, the way the wind's harmonic frequency resonated with specific crystalline structures in the rock face above the command post. Her fingers, calloused and smudged with rock dust, would trace the hairline fractures in the boulders that formed their primary blast wall, her eyes seeing not just cracks, but stories of uplift, erosion, and pressure. She was a small woman, easily lost in the oversized field jacket she wore against the perpetual chill. Her face was a collection of sharp angles and quiet observation, her gray eyes seemingly fixed on a point somewhere beyond the visible horizon. To the soldiers of the 77th Mechanized Infantry, she was the Rock Witch, a peculiar civilian specialist foisted upon them by some high-level command, a piece of a puzzle that didn't fit their picture of war. Her workspace in the corner of the crowded command center was an island of meticulous order in an ocean of tactical chaos. While holographic maps flickered with enemy troop dispositions and comms chatter filled the air with clipped, urgent reports, her screens displayed something else entirely. They showed seismographic data, spectrographic analysis of mineral deposits, and complex models of acoustic wave propagation through the mountain's core. She moved between them with a quiet economy of motion, her focus absolute. She was cataloging the mountain's pulse, learning its language of stress and shear. The soldiers gave her a wide berth, their incomprehension curdling into a mixture of suspicion and pity. She was an academic in a kill zone, a scientist where they needed a soldier. The antithesis of Eris Thorne was Captain Eva Rostova. Rostova commanded FOB Erebos, and she did so with an authority forged in the crucible of a dozen deployments. She was a tall, formidable woman whose presence seemed to suck the air out of a room, Her voice was a blunt instrument, her orders were hammers, and her worldview was a fortress built of protocol and firepower. She saw the Argus Range not as a geological entity, but as a three-dimensional battle space defined by fields of fire, kill zones, and avenues of approach. The mountain was an obstacle, a piece of terrain to be dominated and controlled. The silence was simply a tactical condition, a lack of enemy contact that she found more unnerving than a firefight. She believed in overwhelming force, in the rigid application of doctrine, and in the clear, unambiguous hierarchy of command. Rostova saw Thorn as a profound irritation, a symbol of the bureaucratic meddling that she despised. A geologist. Here, it was absurd. She had protested the assignment through official channels, arguing that Thorn's presence was a waste of resources and a potential liability. Her protests were met with a curt, classified directive from a level of command she couldn't argue with. She is an essential asset. Accommodate her. Full stop. The order only deepened Rostova's resentment. She watched Thorn from across the command center, saw her tapping at her strange instruments and collecting her useless rocks, and felt a hot spike of contempt. This quiet, unassuming woman was an insult to the brutal reality of their situation. She was a distraction, a civilian playing scientist in a place where men and women were fighting and dying. The captain decided, with the cold certainty that defined her, that the situation required correction. She would put the scientist in her place. The confrontation occurred, as Rostova intended, in a place where the captain's authority was absolute, the makeshift firing range. It was a desolate stretch of gravel carved out of the mountainside, where the crack of rifle fire was swallowed almost instantly by the immense, sound-deadening landscape. Thorn was there, not firing a weapon, but setting up a portable acoustic sensor near the primary impact berm. She was calibrating it, tapping its casing, and watching the waveforms on her datapad, oblivious to the soldiers practicing their marksmanship nearby. Rostova strode onto the range, her boots crunching on the loose scree with an aggressive rhythm. The firing ceased as the soldiers saw her approach. They snapped to attention, their rifles held at low ready. Rostova ignored them. Her focus was entirely on the small woman in the oversized jacket. "Dr. Thorn," she called out, her voice sharp enough to chip stone. Thorn looked up slowly, her expression unreadable. She finished her calibration before turning her full attention to the captain. "Captain Rostova," she replied, her voice soft but clear, carrying easily in the thin air. "What precisely do you think you are doing?" Rostova asked, stopping a few feet away. She gestured dismissively at the sensor. "This is a live-fire training area. It is not a laboratory for your little hobbies." The use of the word hobbies was deliberate, a calculated barb designed to diminish and humiliate. The soldiers watched, their faces impassive masks, but the tension was palpable. Thorn looked from the sensor back to the captain. "I'm measuring the spallation patterns and the percussive propagation through the substrate. The rifle impacts are a useful, consistent data source." Her explanation was factual, devoid of any emotional inflection. It was the answer a scientist would give, which only served to further infuriate the captain. "I don't care about your substrate," Rostova sneered, stepping closer. The difference in their physical presence was stark. Rostova was a predator, Thorn a placid observer. "I care about the fact that you are a civilian, an unarmed non-combatant, loitering on a live-fire range in an active combat zone. You are a liability. Your work is irrelevant to the mission of this outpost, which is to locate and destroy the enemy. You are a distraction. Leave the range. Now. It was a direct order, delivered with the full weight of her command. It was meant to be the end of the conversation, a public reassertion of the proper order of things. Thorn did not move. She met Rostova's hard gaze without flinching. Her own eyes seemed to see through the captain, to be focused on the mountain behind her. "The mission of this outpost," Thorn stated, her voice still unnervingly calm, "is to survive. You cannot destroy an enemy you do not understand. And you do not understand this enemy because you do not understand the terrain. They are not using the mountains to hide. They are using the mountains as a weapon." A dangerous silence followed. Rostova's face tightened, her jaw clenching. The sheer audacity of the statement, the quiet, academic certainty with which it was delivered, was a direct challenge to her authority, her experience, her entire way of war. "You are a geologist," Rostova said, her voice dropping to a low, menacing growl. "You will confine your activities to your designated workspace. You will not interfere with military operations. You will not question my understanding of the enemy. That is an order, Doctor. Is that clear?" "Perfectly," Thorn said. She turned back to her sensor, picked it up with delicate care, and began packing it into its case. She did not hurry. Her movements were deliberate, economical. She had neither won nor lost the confrontation. She had simply registered it, like a seismic event, and moved on. As she walked away, leaving Rostova standing rigid with fury in the sudden silence of the range, the soldiers exchanged uneasy glances. They had just witnessed something they did not understand. They had seen their immovable commander challenged not by force, but by a quiet, unshakable logic that seemed to emanate from the very rock they stood upon. The mountain watched, and the wind whispered secrets that only one person in FOB Erebos seemed to hear. The first tremors of the real crisis were already propagating through the stone, and the captain, for all her strength, was deaf to them. The crisis did not arrive with the roar of an engine or the scream of incoming artillery. It came as a whisper, a low, pervasive hum that seemed to emanate from the rock itself. It started at 2:13 hours, a vibration that grew from a subtle tremor in the soles of their boots to a deep, gut-churning thrum that resonated in the bones. The lights in the command center flickered, and the holographic displays dissolved into shimmering curtains of static. Sergeant Kenji Tanaka, the comm specialist, swore under his breath, his fingers flying across his console. "I've lost everything," he announced, his voice tight. "All comms, all satellite links, all sensor feeds. It's not jamming, Captain. It's a cancellation. The carrier waves are just gone. It's like the air itself is eating our signals." Captain Rostova stood before the main tactical display, which was now just a blank, shimmering blue wall. The hum intensified, and the prefabricated walls of the command center began to groan in protest. "Sit rep," she barked, her voice cutting through the rising anxiety. "What is it? Seismic event?" In her corner, Eris Thorn was already standing. Her own displays were still active, powered by an independent, shielded source. They showed a terrifying symmetry. A complex, repeating waveform pulsed across her main screen, a perfect, unnatural harmonic. "It is not a natural event, Captain," Thorn said, her voice cutting through the low hum. "It's a resonance cascade. They've found the mountain's fundamental frequency. They are turning the entire massif into a tuning fork." Rostova shot her a look of pure venom. "English, Doctor! Now! Before Thorne could reply, the mountain screamed. It was a high-frequency shriek that bypassed the ears and drilled directly into the skull. Men cried out, clapping their hands over their helmets, their teeth aching with sympathetic vibration. Dust rained down from the ceiling panels. Then came the first impact. It wasn't an explosion. It was a concussive blow from below, a giant fist striking the foundation of the base. The entire structure lurched violently to the left. Men and equipment were thrown across the room. "Attack!" Rostova roared, regaining her footing. "Perimeter defense, return fire. Target the northern ridge, Sector Gamma. That's where their spotters have to be." The automated sentry guns on the perimeter, programmed to respond to hostile action, swiveled and opened fire. The heavy staccato of their cannons was a familiar, comforting sound of violence. But it was a mistake. The moment the guns fired, the shriek from the mountain intensified tenfold. A second, more powerful impact struck the base, this time from the east wall. A huge crack spiderwebbed across the reinforced concrete of the command center's foundation. "Cease fire! Cease fire!" Kenji yelled from his station, his face pale. "Captain, the impacts are synchronized with our weapon discharges. They're using the kinetic energy to pinpoint us." Rostova's mind raced, cycling through doctrinal responses. This was an ambush, but of a kind she had never encountered. It was asymmetrical warfare taken to a new, terrifying level. "Call for air support! Scramble the QRF!" she commanded. "No comms, Captain," Kenji reminded her, his voice strained. "We're completely deaf and dumb." "Then we fight with what we have," Rostova declared, her jaw set. "All personnel to battle stations. We lay down suppressive fire on all suspected enemy positions. We make them pay for every inch." She was falling back on the only thing she knew: aggression. It was the doctrine that had served her for her entire career. You are attacked. You attack back, harder. Brute force was a language everyone understood, but the mountain did not speak that language. As her soldiers began to fire their rifles from the sandbagged emplacements, each muzzle flash was answered by a tremor. The enemy wasn't firing back with bullets or rockets. They were answering with geology. Small, targeted rock slides began to cascade down the slopes, not large enough to bury the base, but perfectly aimed to take out sentry positions and block lines of sight. A boulder the size of a transport truck dislodged from the peak above and crashed down, obliterating the motor pool in a cloud of pulverized rock and twisted metal. The ground itself became the enemy's weapon. Rostova watched the chaos unfold on the few remaining local camera feeds, her confidence beginning to fray. Her methods, the time-tested tactics of modern warfare, were not just ineffective, they were counterproductive. Every action she took, every order she gave, seemed to make the situation worse. Firing their weapons accelerated the destruction. Fortifying their position was useless when the very ground they stood on was being shaken apart. The enemy wasn't at their gates. They were in the foundation, in the rock, in the very air itself. They were besieged by a phantom that struck with the weight of 1 billion tons of granite. The hum was a constant, maddening pressure, punctuated by the shrieking resonance and the bone-jarring impacts that threw them around like dolls. The base was dying, her soldiers were trapped, and her rule book was blank. For the first time in her career, Captain Eva Rostova did not know what to do. The failure of orthodoxy was absolute, and in the terrifying silence between impacts, she could feel the cold grip of genuine fear. The command center was a scene of controlled panic. Men shouted useless reports into dead comms. Others tried to secure equipment that slid across the tilting floor. The structure groaned, a wounded beast on the verge of collapse. Another impact, sharper this time, threw Rostova against the now dead holographic table. The lights went out, plunging them into the emergency red glow of backup lighting. In the crimson gloom, the faces of her soldiers were masks of terror. Her authority, her entire world of order and response, had crumbled to dust. She was paralyzed. A single clear voice cut through the chaos. "Stop!" It was Eris Thorn. She stood in her corner, her small form illuminated by the glow of her still-functioning screens. She had not been thrown off balance. She seemed anchored to the floor, a still point in a collapsing world. All eyes turned to her. "Power down everything non-essential," she said, her voice calm and precise, carrying an authority that had nothing to do with rank. "Extinguish all lights except for this station. Cease all movement and stop shooting. You are ringing the dinner bell." Rostova pushed herself up, her face a mixture of fury and desperation. "Who the hell do you think you are? You don't give orders here." Thorn's gaze met hers, and for the first time, Rostova saw not an academic, but something ancient and unyielding, like the rock itself. "Your orders are getting your people killed, Captain," Thorn stated, not as an accusation, but as a simple, observable fact. "You are trying to fight a platoon of soldiers. You are at war with a tectonic plate. You cannot win a fistfight with a mountain." She turned to her screen, where a complex topographical map glowed. It was overlaid with pulsing, concentric rings of light. "They're not on the ridges, they are in the mountain. They have drilled into a series of resonant cavities deep inside the massif. They are using low-frequency acoustic drivers to create a destructive interference pattern focused right here. Our base is the null point, the place where the waves cancel each other out with explosive force. Every shot you fire, every engine you run, every radio signal you try to send gives them a clearer acoustic picture of us. It allows them to fine-tune the frequency, to hit us harder." Silence. The men and women in the room looked from their captain to the scientist. They had felt the truth of her words in their bones with every impact. Rostova's strategy was failing. Thorn was offering an explanation. It was a terrifying explanation, but it was something. Sergeant Kenji Tanaka was the first to move. He had spent the last hour watching his equipment die, feeling the electronic impotence of his position. He was a man of data and signals, and Thorn was speaking a language of data and signals he could understand, even if the medium was geology instead of electronics. He looked at Rostova, saw the indecision warring with pride on her face, and then he looked at Thorn. He made a choice. "My board is already dead, ma'am," he said, his voice directed at Thorn. "What do you need?" The use of ma'am was a small thing, but in the rigid hierarchy of the military, it was a tectonic shift. Authority was flowing away from the captain's bars and toward the quiet woman in the corner. Rostova saw it, her expression hardening, but she said nothing. She had no other options. To object now would be to admit she had no plan at all. "I need a team of 2, Thorn said, her eyes fixed on her screen. "I need them to take 3 M84 concussion grenades to these coordinates." A point on the holographic map pulsed, a location nearly a kilometer away on a sheer rock face. "They must be placed precisely, not near the coordinates, on them. I have marked the exact seams in the strata. They must be detonated simultaneously, not sequentially. The timing must be perfect to the millisecond." A heavy silence filled the room. Her plan was insane. Send 2 soldiers out into that cacophony, into the crossfire of a geological attack, to plant grenades on a rock. For what purpose? Rostova demanded, her voice strained. What will that accomplish? Thorne finally looked away from her screen, her gray eyes locking onto the captain's. You want to fight back. Fine, we will. But we will not use bullets. We will use the mountain. That rock face is the keystone for the entire western ridge. It's under immense tectonic stress, a geological fracture waiting to happen. The enemy has been carefully avoiding it, using frequencies that dampen the vibrations in that sector. They know how unstable it is. She pointed back to her screen. The simultaneous detonation of those grenades, at that specific point, will not create a large explosion. It will create a single, perfect shear wave. It will introduce a counter frequency into their system. It will not destroy the mountain. It will give it a voice it is not expecting. We are going to make the mountain sing their song, right back at them. Her words hung in the air, a plan so audacious, so alien to their way of thinking, that it was almost incomprehensible. But in its elegant, terrifying logic, there was a glimmer of hope. It was not a plan of brute force. It was a plan of surgical precision. It was checkmate, played on a board made of granite and time. Kenji looked at Thorne, his face set with a new resolve. He nodded once. I'll get the volunteers. Authority had not been seized. It had been ceded, flowing naturally to the only person in the room who understood the battle they were truly in. 2 soldiers, a corporal named Diaz and a specialist named Ivanova, volunteered. Their faces were grim, etched with fear, but also a sliver of desperate purpose. They trusted Sergeant Kenji, and Kenji trusted the Rock Witch. That was enough. Thorne briefed them herself, not with tactical jargon, but with the quiet intensity of a surgeon explaining a delicate procedure. She showed them images of the rock face on her datapad, pointing out the specific crystalline veins they had to find. The grenades go here, she said, tapping a faint, dark line in the gneiss. Not an inch to the left or right. Wedge them deep into this fissure. The detonator must be flush with the olivine deposit. Do you see it? They nodded, their eyes wide. They were being asked to read the rock, to see the battlefield as she saw it. Kenji jury-rigged a synchronized detonator, linking it to a timer on his own console. They'll have a 5-minute window once they arm it, he told Thorne. I can trigger it from here to the millisecond you specify. They won't have 5 minutes, Thorne replied calmly. The moment they arm it, the enemy will detect the electronic signature. The resonance attacks will focus on their position. They will have 90 seconds, maximum. The 2 soldiers overheard this. A flicker of fresh terror crossed their faces, but it was quickly replaced by a hard resolve. They nodded again, slung their rifles, and took the modified grenades. As they slipped out of the shattered command center into the screaming, vibrating darkness, the rest of the crew watched them go on a single, flickering security feed. They were 2 small figures against an immense, hostile world. Thorne turned her full attention back to her console. Her fingers moved with an unnatural speed, typing lines of code, adjusting models, her mind processing a torrent of incoming data from the few remaining perimeter sensors. She was not just watching the enemy, she was watching the mountain. She tracked the propagation of the enemy's acoustic waves, the stress building in the rock, the subtle shifts in the harmonic pattern. It was a deadly, intricate dance, and she was preparing to cut in. Captain Rostova stood behind her, a silent, rigid observer. She had become a bystander to the defense of her own base. The world of clear commands and predictable outcomes was gone, replaced by this strange, terrifying calculus of geology and sound. "They're at the location," Kenji announced, his voice tense. The camera feed showed Diaz and Ivanova clinging to the rock face, the wind tearing at them. They were frantically clearing loose rock from the fissure Thorne had indicated. "The enemy's frequency is shifting," Thorne said, her eyes never leaving her screen. "They're starting to sense the anomaly. Tell them to arm it, now." "Diaz, Ivanova, arm the package. Arm it now," Kenji relayed into his mic. On the screen, they saw Diaz connect the final wire. A small red light began to blink on their package. Instantly, the hum that filled the command center quadrupled in intensity. The entire base screamed and lurched as a massive blow struck from directly beneath them. The camera feed from the rock face shook violently, almost cutting out. "They're being targeted," someone yelled. "They know," Thorne said, her voice a whip crack. "Kenji, on my mark, the next primary wave is building. They're trying to trigger a full collapse on top of the base. But they have to build the resonance first. It gives us a window. The peak of the sine wave is our trigger point." She watched a glowing green line on her monitor climb steadily. "Wait for it. Wait." The command center felt like it was in the grip of a giant, shaking it to pieces. Men held on to consoles to stay upright. The sound was a physical agony. "The wave is peaking," Kenji shouted. The green line on Thorne's monitor formed a perfect clean crest. "Now," she said. "Perfect." Kenji's thumb slammed down on the detonation key. For a fraction of a second, nothing happened. The violent shaking continued. The agonizing shriek went on. Rostova's heart sank. It had failed. And then the world went silent. It was not a gradual quieting. It was a sudden, absolute cessation. The deafening hum vanished. The skull-drilling shriek disappeared. The violent, bone-jarring tremors stopped. One moment, they were inside a collapsing drum. The next, they were in a vacuum. The silence was so profound, so complete, that it was more shocking than the noise had been. It pressed in on them, a heavy velvet blanket. In the crimson emergency lighting of the command center, everyone froze, their ears ringing in the sudden void. They looked at each other, then at Thorne. She was still watching her screen. The complex, malevolent waveforms from the enemy were gone, replaced by a single, massive, slowly decaying sine wave. It was the mountain's own voice. Far away, carried on the thin air, they heard a deep, resonant rumble, like distant thunder. It was not the sound of an explosion, but the sound of 1 billion tons of rock settling, a sigh from the deep earth. On the security feed, Diaz and Ivanova were pressed against the rock face, their bodies trembling from the aftershock of their own survival. But they were alive. The targeted rock slides had ceased. The enemy's assault was over. Thorne had not just fought back. She had ended the fight. She had taken the enemy's weapon, the mountain itself, and used its own immense power to create a feedback loop so perfect, so overwhelming, that it had blinded and deafened their sensors, likely shattering their acoustic drivers into useless fragments. She had not fired a shot. She had performed acoustic surgery on a mountain, and in doing so, had excised the enemy like a tumor. The threat was neutralized. The silence that remained was the silence of victory, a quiet so complete it felt sacred. In that moment, the soldiers of FOB Erebos looked at the small, unassuming woman in the corner not as a rock witch, but as a savior. They had witnessed a miracle of physics, a triumph not of firepower, but of intellect. And Captain Rostova finally understood the the chasm that separated her own tactical knowledge from the terrifying, profound genius of Eris Thorne. For 10 minutes, the silence held. The only sounds were the ragged breaths of the survivors and the faint crackle of stressed metal as the base settled. Kenji worked furiously at his console, trying to reboot systems to pierce the electronic void the enemy had created. Then, a single speaker hissed to life. It wasn't the open channel, but a tightly encrypted, high-priority link that hadn't been active since the base was established. A voice, calm and authoritative, filled the command center. It was a voice that carried the weight of immense rank, a voice accustomed to being obeyed across continents. Erebos Command, this is General Maddox. Report. Captain Rostova snapped to attention, her training taking over. She strode to the comms panel, her face a mask of grim professionalism. General Maddox, this is Captain Rostova, commanding FOB Erebos. We were under sustained attack. Communications and sensors were disabled. The attack has ceased. We have sustained heavy structural damage, but minimal casualties. She delivered the report crisply, a commander reasserting control. There was a pause on the other end. Then the general's voice came back, devoid of warmth. I am aware of the attack, Captain. I've been monitoring the satellite data. Your base dropped off the grid, then reappeared with a seismic event that registered on a global scale. You were not under attack. You were being dismantled. My question is, how did you stop it? Rostova hesitated. The truth was a humiliation she could barely bring herself to utter. Sir, there was an unconventional response, initiated by a civilian specialist on site. Another pause, this one longer, heavier. When Maddox spoke again, his tone had changed. It was sharp, focused, and it was not directed at Rostova. Put her on. Sir? Rostova asked, confused. Captain, do not make me repeat myself, Maddox said, his voice like chipping ice. Put Geode on the line. Now! Rostova froze. Geode, a call sign. She turned slowly, her eyes finding Eris Thorne, who was calmly observing the exchange, her expression unreadable. The name echoed in the captain's mind, a half-remembered piece of intelligence briefing from years ago. A ghost, a legend from the Black Ops community, a name spoken only in hushed tones when discussing deep Earth warfare and environmental denial campaigns. It was a myth, a boogeyman used to scare strategists. It couldn't be. Thorne walked to the comms panel, took the receiver from Rostova's numb fingers, and spoke into it. Her voice was as calm and factual as ever. Geode here. Status report, Eris, Maddox said, the familiarity in his tone a physical blow to Rostova. The opposition was using a phased acoustic array drilled into the primary resonant cavity of the massif, Thorne reported clinically. They were amateurs, talented, but they failed to account for the tectonic shear stress along the western fault line. They mistook it for a dampening field. I introduced a counter-frequency via a focused percussive event. The resulting feedback loop likely slagged their emitters and buried their position under several thousand tons of granite. The threat is neutralized. Erebos is secure, but structurally compromised. I recommend immediate evacuation. The general sighed, a sound of profound relief. I read your initial assessment of the Argus range. You predicted this was a possibility. I sent you there to observe, not to fight a one-woman war. They forced my hand, Thorne said simply. I see that, Maddox replied. He paused. Captain Rostova. Rostova stood ramrod straight, her face pale. Sir, you are to transfer your command authority to Sergeant Kenji Tanaka, effective immediately, Maddox ordered, his voice cold and final. He will oversee the evacuation of all personnel. You will be confined to your quarters pending a full inquiry into your performance. You had the single greatest strategic asset on the continent at your side, and your reports indicate you had her calibrating sensors on a firing range. You mistook a scalpel for a butter knife, Captain. You are relieved. The words were a public execution. Rostova's face, which had remained a stoic mask through the entire attack, finally crumpled. The humiliation was absolute. She didn't speak. She simply nodded, a jerky, mechanical motion, her eyes fixed on a point on the far wall. She turned and walked away, her rigid posture the only thing holding her together. Her fall from power was as swift and brutal as the geological forces Thorn had just commanded. Thorn watched her go, her expression unchanged. There was no triumph in her eyes, no satisfaction. There was only the quiet, dispassionate observation of a system correcting itself. She then looked over at Kenji, who was staring at her with an expression of pure, unadulterated awe. "Sergeant," she said, handing him the receiver, "the general has instructions for you." With that, the revelation was complete. Aris Thorn was not a civilian. She was not a geologist. She was Geode, the architect of this new, terrifying form of warfare. The small, unassuming badge on her jacket, the cracked Geode, was not a university emblem. It was the insignia of the U.S. Army's ultra-secret 9th Directorate for Lithospheric Warfare, a unit so classified that most of the military didn't even know it existed. She had written the doctrine the enemy had tried to use against them, and in her quiet, methodical way, she had just provided the final, bloody addendum to her own work. The old order was broken. A new one, based not on rank, but on sheer, undeniable competence, had just been born in the echoing silence of the mountain. In the hours that followed, a new reality settled over FOB Erebos. The hierarchy had been inverted. Sergeant Kenji, his face a mask of disbelief and grim determination, was now in command. He moved with a newfound confidence, his orders crisp and clear as he organized the evacuation. And his first unofficial act as commander was to establish a new, unspoken protocol. All strategic decisions were deferred to Dr. Thorn. She was no longer the rock witch. She was the final authority. Men who had once dismissed her now watched her every move with a reverence bordering on fear. They saw her directing repair crews, not by shouting orders, but by pointing to stress fractures in the support beams that no one else could see, explaining how to brace them against the mountain's new, settled state. She spoke of load-bearing capacity and isostatic rebound with the same calm certainty she had used to describe their doom. The atmosphere in the command center was transformed. The loud, aggressive energy of Rostova's command was gone, replaced by a quiet, focused efficiency. People spoke in lower tones. They moved with purpose. They listened. When Thorn advised Kenji on the safest route for the evacuation convoy, taking into account the new patterns of rock instability, he didn't question it. He simply relayed the coordinates, his trust in her absolute. A new order had been established, an order dictated by logic and expertise, not by the insignia sewn onto a collar. Thorn, for her part, seemed oblivious to the change. She showed no pleasure in her vindication, no arrogance in her newfound status. She was simply a problem solver, and the problem was now shifting from survival to extraction. Late in the planning cycle, as Thorn was reviewing seismic aftershock data, Kenji approached her. He didn't speak for a moment, just stood near her workstation. In his hands, he held a steaming mug. He placed it gently on the corner of her desk. It was coffee, the first fresh brew since the attack. It was a simple gesture, a peace offering from a world of soldiers to her world of science. It was an apology, a thank you, and a sign of ultimate respect, all contained in a single, humble cup. "Ma'am," he began, then hesitated. "Doctor, Eris." He seemed unsure what to call her. The feedback loop you created, it didn't just jam them, it felt punitive. The final resonance spike was orders of magnitude higher than necessary for simple disruption. It wasn't a question born of suspicion, but of deep, intellectual curiosity. He was the one person on the base who had the framework to even begin to understand what she had done. Thorne took a sip of the coffee. She looked at the lingering waveform on her screen, the mountain's dying echo. "Their methods were crude," she said, her voice quiet. "They used brute force. They hurt the mountain. It's an elegant structure, billions of years old. What I did was simply restore the harmony." There was a cold, final quality to her words. She had not just defeated an enemy, she had passed judgment on them for their lack of finesse, their disrespect for the medium in which they worked. In her world, that was the greatest sin of all. Kenji nodded slowly, a profound understanding dawning in his eyes. He was not just in the presence of a brilliant scientist or a secret weapon. He was in the presence of a force that viewed mountains as living things and defended them with a terrifying, righteous power. He left her to her work, the quiet acknowledgement complete. When the first evacuation chopper arrived, its rotors beating a reassuring rhythm against the thin air, Thorne was already packed. Her gear consisted of a single, worn rucksack containing her sensors and a few personal effects. Her job was done. The base was secure, its personnel were being extracted, and a new command team was inbound to assess the aftermath. She had arrived as an enigma and would depart as a legend. She walked toward the helicopter, her small frame silhouetted against the immense, silent peaks. Kenji saw her leaving and jogged to catch up. "Dr. Thorne," he said, "where will you go?" She paused and looked up at the mountains, her gray eyes filled with a distant, unreadable light. "There are other mountains," she said. "There are always other mountains." It was all the explanation she offered. She climbed into the chopper, and without a backward glance, she was gone, disappearing into the vast, indifferent sky as quietly as she had arrived. She left behind a story that would be told in whispers for years, a cautionary tale for arrogant commanders, and a legend for those who valued quiet competence. Eris Thorne was a ghost, a whisper in the deep earth. She was not a soldier who fought for ground, but a guardian who understood it. She came not to conquer the mountain, but to listen to it, and in doing so, she had reminded them all of a fundamental truth. True power does not always come from the barrel of a gun. Sometimes it comes from a deep, profound understanding of the world, and the quiet courage to act on that knowledge when everyone else is lost in the noise. She was a force of nature, as patient, as powerful, and as eternal as the rock she so revered, leaving behind a silence that was filled with a new and lasting respect.